Yesterday, I asked if masculinity was a problem in the United States, and yes, I said it is. Well, how do we begin to think about it differently? Angela Parker, Boozy Bible scholar, going in scripture through womanist eyes, using my Sonia G Blender Pro, going into the Natasha Denona eye sculpture. I'm just going to go into R1 right here just to start carving out my crease. So, I'm thinking about Jesus now as I think about young boys today. And if you're raising particularly white boys, how do you begin to talk about Jesus and talk about aspirational masculinity? Well, I was just listening to one creator talk about patriarchy is ruining men. And that creator was saying that patriarchy and the concepts of patriarchy actually makes boys and men hate women, and it makes men hate any aspect of empathy or feminine traits like patience, compassion, empathy, kindness, all the traits that actually Paul talks about in Galatians: love, joy, peace. Those traits, kindness, gentleness, any of those traits that seem to be empathetic, gentle, humility, those become antithetical to what patriarchy says men are supposed to be: strong, stoic, stubborn, resistant. So, what do? Well, I would argue that the way that patriarchy understands masculinity, particularly in the Roman Empire, needs to be understood, and how Jesus contradicts that patriarchy or the ideas of masculinity in our biblical text. Taking my Sonia G Worker Pro, I'm going to go into an old palette, the Natasha Denona Metropolis palette. And I'm going to go into a shade called Lethal. Lethal is a green shade right here. And I'm going to use this to go a little bit lower in my crease. So I just brought up the text of Galatians. In Galatians 3:1, Paul says to the Galatian people something like this. It was before your eyes, Jesus vividly portrayed as crucified. It was before your eyes that Jesus was vividly portrayed as crucified. And in the ancient world, crucifixion essentially unmasculinized a person. Jesus, because he underwent crucifixion, he was demasculinized, unmasculinized. What does that mean? Because Jesus had lost control of his body, he would not be considered a man anymore. Jesus would have suffered being stripped naked. He would have been hauled in front of a crowd, and he would have been beaten and abused by Roman soldiers. We know from the biblical text that he was spat upon, beat, but because the world understood what crucifixion looked like, the biblical text spares us a lot of the details of crucifixion. But one of those details was nakedness in crucifixion as well. And the idea of a man being naked in front of a crowd was also the idea of demasculinization. Keeping the same brush, going into this green shade that will deepen out my outer corner. So Jesus would have been unmasculinized or demasculinized. And in the context of the Greco-Roman world, they understood that demasculinization, because in the hierarchy of masculinity, and if you heard my video from yesterday, I talked about hegemonic masculinity and complicit masculinity. Hegemonic masculinity is the top of masculinity, and complicit masculinity are the men who are underneath the hegemonic man. In the Greco-Roman world, the emperor would be the hegemonic masculine, and his senators would also be a tier of hegemonic masculinity, but everyone underneath would be complicit and carry out the work of the emperor. So the soldiers would be complicit, and the men underneath the soldiers would be tiers below. And that's another level that Raywin Connell talks about. And I referenced Raywin Connell in my work, or in my work as well, but in my video from yesterday. So Jesus and the men in the Palestine area would be another level of masculinity below the men who ruled over Palestine, Judea. I'm going to go into another shade with my Wayne Goss number 7, the flathead. I'm going to go into this shade right here. It is called Orium. So this is a very sparkly shade I'm going to start using on my lid. And I'm putting that on the center. So Jesus and the disciples and all of the people in Palestine would have been viewed as enslaved people, essentially, because Palestine was viewed as an enslaved province as well under the rule of the Roman Empire. And so Jesus, as a member of Palestine, would have been viewed as an unmanned man. So he would have been demasculinized. So what does that mean? That means that when we read our biblical text, we have to understand Jesus and his decreased masculinity. And when we talk about being followers of Jesus, we have to understand that Jesus is living in a world of decreased masculinity. And because I'm still just loving this Patrick Ta duo, I'm going to take my Wayne Goss and go into this top shade to top off this green eyeshadow look. So when we talk about aspirational masculinity in today's day and age, how do we begin to teach our boys what aspirational masculinity looks like? I think we actually be true to the biblical text and begin to understand that masculinity looks very differently in the Greco-Roman world, and that masculinity can look differently in today's day and age. That Jesus went to the cross in order to be an example for us today on what masculinity can look like. It did not need to look like the toxic or hegemonic masculinity of the Greco-Roman man. So here's the final look, friends. I used my Natasha Denona eye sculpt and sculpture in addition to the Natasha Denona Metropolis palette, along with the Patrick Ta to major eye dimension duo always on your mind. So Angela Parker, boozy Bible scholar, thinking about masculinity and what it looks like to think about Jesus as we begin to talk about aspirational masculinity. So as always, friends, be bold, be brave, be brilliant. And I'm still thinking about masculinity, so I'll do another scripture through Womanist eyes and think about masculinity probably in about 2 days. I'll talk to you soon.